Okay, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome. On behalf of Ohel, Family Children from Family Services, I want to welcome everybody. I am Dr. Blumenthal. I'm the Director of Trauma, Crisis Intervention, and Bereavement for Ohel. We're doing this as a joint presentation with Hatzalah of Crown Heights. The title is Trauma Upon Trauma. I guess I forgot the rest, but really dealing with the trauma that all of you have had to deal with in recent weeks, as being the first responders very often to people in crisis during the coronavirus. I want to personally thank Rochi Smetana, who really arranged this. Also want to thank David Mandela, our CEO, and our Presidium, Jay Kestenbaum and Mel Zachter, who make it possible for me to give these kind of workshops, as well as our technology department that makes schlamazels like me, who are able to give these kind of Zoom webinars. This is going to be recorded, so if anybody knows someone who was not able to make it but would feel would benefit from it, you can access it probably in a day or two from the Ohel website. And very often these are also posted on YouTube, so you can access them there. I have everybody muted. We have 22 people, so it's not an overwhelming crowd. So if somebody wants to ask a question in the middle, there are two ways to do that. You can unmute yourself and ask a question. And I'll try to address it. I would ask you to please remute yourself afterwards, because noise in the background is often very disturbing when you're giving workshops like this to the rest of the audience and to the speaker. Alternatively, you can use the chat, which is at the bottom of your computer or phone, and you can ask a question, and you can do it privately if you want, direct it to me privately. If I see chats coming up in the middle, I might stop in the middle of the presentation and address those questions. I will speak now for probably about 20-30 minutes, and then we'll have some time for maybe questions, comments afterwards. I will tell you with all humility that it is actually a humbling experience to be addressing you, the first responders, the Hatzalah responders, because you are among the many, but you are certainly one of the heroes of this crisis. You've taken health risks to ensure the safety and survival of so many people, as you always do. And we cannot probably express enough, those of us are the potential or actual beneficiaries of your services. We cannot thank you enough, and how grateful we are that there are people like you out there who are ready to take these risks and who have spent so much energy training and perfecting your skills for our safety. And so again, I thank you, and I hope I can, this in some small measure, is a way in which I can pay all of you back. Now, we're all self-selected for the kind of work that we do. People who are very skillful or in mathematics are going to become actuaries, maybe accountants, maybe mathematics professors. Those who are skilled in or mechanically skilled will become plumbers, carpenters, builders, etc. Those of us who maybe have somewhat precocious sensitivity or capacity to empathize or connect will go into mental health. So we all sort of self-select for that which make us suited for the kind of work we do. You guys are also self-selected. You are self-selected for your resilience and strength, for your capacity to rush into highly tragic situations. Some of the situations might even be kind of gory and gruesome, and yet to have your wits about you and to know what to do in order to save lives. So there is a certain strength and hardiness that comes with being a first responder, being an EMT, for which, as I said, you have self-selected or others have selected you for. It's therefore sometimes jarring and almost contrary to how you would naturally perceive yourself if the work you're doing gets to you, if it erodes your sense of safety, if it's causing you sleepless nights, if it's causing you anxiety, because you're not supposed to be, let's say, soft. You're not supposed to be vulnerable. If you were, you couldn't do this kind of work. And yet, indeed, no matter how resilient you are, no matter how strong and, I don't know like the term strong, but maybe even thick-skinned you may be for these kind of tragedies, it catches up with you because we're all human. And as I said, sometimes very jarring because you not only have you been selected for this, but you gauge your success in your capacity to go into very dangerous situations that many people would really run away from. And especially now, as I said, even potentially jeopardizing your own health by being around people who may have this highly contagious illness. And if it's getting to you emotionally, it doesn't fit with how you perceive yourself. I mean, let's take as an example a police officer. Imagine a police officer coming to his superior and crying and upset because he came to a house where a young person died or where someone was gravely injured, and they were upset. He's not going to get that promotion to sergeant. So that police officer is going to hide those emotions and are going to suppress them. And I don't have to tell you that when you hide and suppress emotions, they come out in all sorts of ways. So what we're focusing on now and what we're going to be discussing is what's referred to in the literature with three different terms, one of which I don't particularly care for. One of them is called the secondary trauma, sometimes called vicarious trauma. If you're familiar with the word vicarious means when you experience something as somebody else had. And the third term, which I don't particularly like, is sometimes called compassion fatigue. I don't think you get fatigued from being compassionate, so I don't particularly like that term. But I generally refer to it as secondary trauma. And secondary trauma is the trauma that the person who either addresses, let's put it this way, primary trauma is the person who's been traumatized. The person who comes down with COVID-19, who has trouble breathing, is experiencing a primary trauma. The person who has been in a vehicular accident, who has been in a terrorist attack, or even if, let's say, injured in a terrorist attack, he has experienced primary trauma. Secondary trauma is the trauma of the people, one of two things, either the trauma of the people who come to the rescue, like you guys, or like myself and my team who may help that person process it later and they're going to hear about it, or in a tertiary way, even those who read about it or watch it on the videos or on the internet, who see the scenes, the scary scenes, will experience trauma. So the helper becomes traumatized. And I'm going to explain to you what's the psychological process about that, but we know that to be a fact. In fact, if it's of interest to you, it's actually Beferish Rashi in Chumash. In the Shira, it says, Tipol alahem emasa v'fachad, and Rashi says, emasa ala rachokim, pachad ala krovim. The pachad are the Egyptians themselves who were drowning in the ocean, and emasa were the ones who read about it in the Moabite times. So that's secondary trauma, so it's even noted already by our rabbis of old. And nobody is immune to it. If you hear about something, you see something, it affects you, it impacts upon you. And the interesting thing is that secondary trauma very much, in many respects, resembles primary trauma. So as I'm sure you are aware, the person is primarily traumatized, the person who was in the vehicular accident, the person who was a victim of a violent crime, let's say, will have flashbacks, will have trigger responses, where the brain in a way sort of brings the person back to the trauma. The helper who comes to the scene, not every time, as we're going to explain, that's some of the differences with secondary trauma, but is susceptible, not as extreme, not as strong, but is susceptible to some of the post-trauma responses. And therefore, anyone like yourself and myself as well, who does trauma work all day, are susceptible to secondary trauma. And I know for myself, times when it has happened to me, when I have been afflicted by this kind of secondary trauma. And again, it's similar kind of responses. It's flashbacks, it's trigger responses, it's agitation, irritability, difficulty sleeping, not being able to get certain scenes, certain images out of your mind. Now, in a way, and this is what's very important to understand, if there's nothing else, this is something you have to hear. In a way, it's important to know that secondary trauma is, in some respects, worse than primary trauma, and for the following reason. If somebody is in a highly traumatic situation, somebody nearly drowned, somebody is in a fire, a residential fire. And they're traumatized afterwards. Everybody understands. It's a scary, life-threatening situation. You can have a traumatic response. The Hatzalah driver is not going to be traumatized by the 1 or 2 calls he gets that day, no matter how awful. And it may not even be the first 10 or 15 calls. He may walk away and, not have any kind of response. But each call sort of chips away from his sense of safety. And it's not that one big call, it's the 25th, the 26th. It's cumulative. It builds up. And each one, in an imperceptible way, you don't even sense it happening, eats away in your sense of safety and security. Sometimes it's because it does hit home. I've had people call me, and I've had a number of Hatzalah drivers call me and say, I went to somebody's house, a girl cut herself, she was in pain, and she's the same age as my daughter, and she looks like my daughter. And it got to me. Or when I was a kid, I had a similar incident happen to me, and when I came to this scene, it reminded me of that, and then I had a traumatic response. So sometimes it adds up. And the thing that's tricky about it, and that's what I'm saying, in some respects it's more pernicious and dangerous than primary trauma, is that it kind of blindsides you. It hits you and you can't make sense of it. And I can't tell you how many times I've gotten these calls. I'll say to me, Doc, I don't get it. This is my 15th, 25th, 30th pedestrian accident of seeing people lying on the street, unconscious, broken bones, bleeding. And everyone I've handled it. And now this one, I can't get out of my head. I'm dreaming about it. It's bothering me. I can't relax. Why is this one? This one's no different. I didn't know the guy. It was no different than all the other people because each one had it and it catches up with you. By the way, interestingly enough, we've even had this experience on times with a Chaver Kadisha, where there'll be a tahara, and a tahara for a young person in particular. And it just finally gets them. And then it's really not that, because that one was so different, but it was the 20th one of the year. And this one was the straw that broke the camel's back, and that's why it's in a way to remain protected from secondary trauma. It's so important to process, especially some of those very hairy, difficult calls, to process it, even if you're not feeling the trauma, because it'll catch up with you. And I will tell you that in the Ohel trauma team, if somebody goes on an intervention after trauma, somebody has to go to, let's say, a death notification or something like that, it's a requirement that they have to come back to me or one of my counterparts, preferably in person, but sometimes they can, so in person or on the phone or via Zoom, and just talk about it and process it, because otherwise they're going to get burned out. It's going to catch up with them. So that's the tricky thing, and that's why it's important, especially now, especially after the kind of few weeks that you've had, that you process it, that you talk about it. And we'll talk about what you need to do. And by the way, it's especially now when we're all under pressure and tension, and we're all worried about the health and well-being of our family, of our loved ones, of our grandparents, it's going to hit home all the more. And when you're constantly attending to the needs of people who looks like they have this COVID-19, and you're worried yourself about your own personal safety, your home safety, it's going to affect you. And there's a mathematics to trauma, by the way, and that's important to understand. I have a colleague who likes to say that 5 out of 4 psychologists don't know math. But when it comes to trauma, the regular math doesn't work either. And if I were to, let's say, I were to attach each traumatic event, let's say, to a 2. Let's say each one's worth 2. And if you have 2 of those 2 traumas, 2 plus 2 doesn't equal 4. 2 plus 2 equals 6. And 2 plus 2 plus 2 equals 26. Trauma on the heels of trauma grows exponentially. Whereas my mother, Alaa Shalom, who was a survivor of 7 concentration camps with a treasure trove of Yiddish sayings, had one, and I won't try to say it in Yiddish out of respect for the language, but one of them was that when a poor man has a hernia, there's a pimple on it. So here too, when you have trauma on the heels of trauma, it affects you all the more. Again, I invite people, if they have any questions or comments, to unmute themselves, jump in, or to use the chat to ask any questions. Now, you have this question, why? Why should somebody else's trauma have such an impact on us? So let me explain to you sort of what the process is and how why this happens from a psychological perspective. Let's imagine for a second you go to a simcha, you go to a bar mitzvah, and you'll end up sitting next to somebody you don't know. So you introduce yourself, says, hi, I'm so-and-so, okay. And then the other guy introduces himself, says, hi, I'm Avram. He says, oh, I'm Yitzchak. So you say to Yitzchak, where are you from? So he says, I'm from Cincinnati. What's going through your head the moment you hear that? Most, people are going to be, you're going to start thinking about everybody you know about Cincinnati, everybody you know in Cincinnati, or anything you know about Cincinnati, or, oh, don't they have a river running through the town? Or, oh, my third cousin, 4 times removed, was a teacher in Cincinnati. Maybe you know him. Why do we do that? Because we are naturally social beings. And when we're with someone, we want to know them. We want to understand them. So we search our own memory banks to see what we have in common. So a similar thing happens, believe it or not, when we do a trauma intervention. We want to understand. We naturally want to understand the person. So we connect with that person and we access as much as we can what it must be like now for this person who's lying injured and in pain. We sort of try to imagine it so we can feel a connection with that person. And hence, we ourselves are traumatized. So ironically, this painful experience or this potentially injurious experience is really governed by a very human need to connect and relate to another person. I see some questions have come through, so let me just quickly read them and see okay, is becoming a principal for 5 different grades, is that considered trauma? Yeah, I mean, I'm not even good. That's trauma beyond, being a teacher in one grade. I will tell you that I was a psychologist in a school many, many years ago, and there was one point, the principal told me that there was 20 minutes where nobody watched the 8th grade boys, and would I cover the 8th grade boys for those 20 minutes? And I'm still traumatized from those 20 minutes. So yeah, absolutely. How to get the fact that death and so much suffering has become the norm and it doesn't bother us anymore? That's a very good question. That's an excellent question. So maybe I can address that. It's an excellent question because it is of concern to many of us in the field of mental health in terms of what's going on. There's been a progression in terms of the response to this COVID-19. I wasn't going to address that, but since the question came up, I'll address it. Initially, I don't think we got it. And the very first few webinars that I gave with ID specialists was really focusing on washing your hands and not touching your face. But even the specialist was saying, yeah, it's the flu. It's no different. If you're careful, nothing will happen. We didn't, I think, realize how incredibly contagious and destructive this virus is. Then there was a frenetic attempt to maintain connected. Some very creative ways in which people were maintaining communal connections, were entertaining children, but connecting with relatives and friends, because we wanted to frantically hold on to what's so integral to our life and our world, which is connection with family and with community. Now, several things are happening. I'm finding 3 things happening right now. One is we're dealing a lot, unfortunately, with the death. And the death is the kind of, it's not only death, but the deprivation of an opportunity to have a funeral, to have a burial, to have a shiva, to say Kaddish. So it's like a double trauma. Healthy, vibrant people who had to be all alone in the hospital for weeks and then succumbing to the illness. So in fact, Ohel is running 5 bereavement groups a week right now for people who have lost, 4 for people who have lost parents to COVID-19 and 1 for people who have lost siblings to COVID-19. And we're in the process of starting one for widows and widowers. And by the way, I do 3 of those groups and we have a waiting list for when those groups are over to start the next one. So there is a very complicated grief response and many people are worried whether the nechama will be as easily achieved given how deprived people are of more typical types of opportunities to grieve. So this has been a major focus right now. And the third thing I'm observing is both kids and adults, particularly those who are the more restless type, who are the more social type, who need that outside stimulation, just about having it. And are ready to just, run out there and forget this social distancing and precautionary measures. They just want to start socializing, interacting with people. So there is that as well that I'm observing. So, but in terms of and then the third, which that's what I'm focusing on, what your question is, for most people is that it's becoming the norm. We're just getting resigned to it. There's less of this enthusiasm, less of this, heightened focus and attempts to preserve communal life. We're kind of like, there's a Yiddish term for it. I forgot. I don't know these, but we're kind of just like acclimating to it. Now, acclimating is a double-edged sword. There's a benefit to it. The fact that we can acclimate to an unpleasant situation makes it more tolerable. So in a way, it's good because we're not as shocked and horrified by what we're going through. The problem with it is that as we acclimate to being isolated and acclimate to being sort of understimulated, when this is over, we're going to have a hard time reacclimating to a social life and reacclimating to connections and relating to people. Even if, let's say, God willing, they come up with a vaccine and a cure and this thing is over, we're not going to just rush right back into the world that we had. It's going to take now a sort of readjustment because we've made this now the norm. So it is an element of concern. And also that, losing the shock and the horror, as I said, we make it like, now this is the way life is supposed to be. And we certainly don't want this to be the way life is supposed to be. Okay, so what do we do? Now that we've established that this can happen, that secondary trauma can occur and it can get to you, how do you prevent it and what do you do if it is impacting upon you? Now, first of all, know your limits. And there are many times I've had to tell some of the most heroic, active EMTs, that's all the people, you need a break. You got to take a leave because it's catching up with you. And know your limits also, that you can't rescue and save everybody. Very often we have to actually focus on the very famous maxim of Salanta, Mensch darf tun, nicht darf. We have to focus on our efforts and not on outcome. You should know that that was a very big issue for the firefighters after the Sassoon fire, who felt so frustrated that they weren't able to save more people. And we really had to do an intervention with them. So know your limitations. Measure yourself by your efforts, and know when you have to take a day or two off, or know when you cannot necessarily be on call every day, that you might have to do 2 days, take 2 days off, etc. Because if you're going to do too much, you're going to do it poorly, and it's going to get to you, and you're going to be rendered incapable. I sort of remember one of my father's favorite lines. He says, "If I give to every worthy cause, I'll become a worthy cause myself." We have to limit. Chesed is giving a piece of yourself, not all of yourself. So know how much you can do, and know your limits. And sometimes less is more, and sometimes taking every other day instead of every day will make you far more effective. If you've been on a very difficult intervention or on a whole bunch of them, and that's really what's happening here, because it's not just each case, but the volume of cases that you have to address. You need to process it, even if you don't feel something now, because it can catch up with you. And processing it can take many different forms. One of the most important is just talking about it. What's one of the fascinating things about trauma is if somebody has been through a traumatic experience and they come to me as a therapist, as a trauma specialist, and they tell me over what happened, and I do little else other than listen or maybe ask a question or two just to clarify matters, they walk out feeling better. They thank me. Sometimes I feel like I'm a charlatan. I'm a faker. What did I do? I just, listened to them. I didn't offer them any great solutions. I didn't give them any kind of profound theological explanations for what they went through. But the mere process of taking a traumatic event and ensconcing it in words makes it more tolerable. Some of you may be familiar with the famous study that Basil Vanderbilt did after 9/11. He took together some survivors of the 9/11 catastrophe. And he hooked them up with a PET scan so he could watch the brain. And he asked them just to remember what happened. And the part of the brain that sort of lit up was deep in the brain center, the amygdala. It's like the most primitive part of the brain that governs just all emotion, fears, etc. The part of the brain we share with the animal kingdom. And then he said to the person, now tell me what happened. Just put it into words. And you could literally see it shift in terms of the activity in the brain from this very primitive, fear-bound kind of part of the brain deep in the brain brainstem to the Broca center, to the frontal cortex, which is the part of the brain that governs language and logic, which is the part of the brain that distinguishes us from the animal kingdom. So merely talking about it, and probably there's no better place than with your fellow Hatzalah guys, because you understand each other. And if you just sit down and just rehash what happened, not looking for faults, not looking to blame anybody, not looking to find what you did wrong, just retell everything you've been through today with each other, you'll walk away feeling less traumatized, and you'll be less susceptible to secondary trauma. That is probably the most important part of protecting your personal equanimity and your mental health. The other thing, by the way, that's important is that remind yourself that you're part of something very special. Pat yourself on the back. I know that sounds like arrogance, like gaiva, it's not good, but we need it. We're human beings, and you need to remind yourselves how important the work is that you're doing and how integral it is and what heroes you really are. And you may have to, it may sound boastful, but we have to do that because I have to do it myself with my work, because otherwise, it's going to be hard to maintain and sustain, and you need that kind of sense of fulfillment, especially when you can't save everybody. So you need to be appreciative of what you know and what you can do. It's interesting. I'll tell you two stories. One of the things I've seen when I've gone to Hatzalah garages, when I've had to help people after some unthinkable tragedy. And one of the things that happens, and again, this shows the cumulative effect. We'll talk a little bit about what just happened. The 6-year-old was run over by a car, and they'll talk about. And next thing I know, every other child that died in a pedestrian accident comes to the fore. They start talking about it from 12 years ago, because it's there, it's embedded in your brain, and it shows the cumulative effects. And it's very healing to just rehash and talk those things over. Another thing, by the way, I've seen when I've gone down to the garage is sometimes you guys will sometimes sort of test each other. I've seen you do this. Like you'll say, okay, let's review. If you have a this and this, what are you doing? If it's a this and this, what are you doing? If you this and this. And I think what happens is you have to reclaim your sense of competence. You have to remind yourselves you really know what you're doing, even if it doesn't work out. And that's very healthy. And it's something I certainly would, would encourage. And by the way, again, remind yourself of your successes as well. Because again, you need that. You need to remind yourself that you're doing something really good and important, and that will insulate you from any of this kind of harm. Outlets are very, very important, especially now as we're so quarantined and socially distanced. Outlets can take many forms. They can be exercise. Exercise is probably about the best, and it doesn't mean you have to bench press 500 pounds. It means a walk. It means stretching. It might mean yoga or something like that. It might mean, a game, not necessarily an intense game of basketball, in the park, but play horse or just a, half-court game or a game of tennis or something. I mean, again, that you can't necessarily do today with restrictions that we have. But exercise, we know, secretes endorphins. It's an outlet. It makes you feel better. It can take, but there are other types of outlets too. If you're just not an exercise or sports person, there's music, whether it's playing music or listening to music. There's art. There's building, woodworking. All these are distractions, constructive types of activities that do have a soothing and relaxing effect. Video games, so-so. While you're playing, you're more relaxed afterwards, especially if it's one of these fast-paced, shoot 'em up kind of games. You can become more agitated afterwards. Same thing, by the way, goes for any kind of videos you may watch. If it's a more soothing, relaxing video, a light comedy, if it's a documentary, if it's not a terribly violent or intense drama, it can be soothing, relaxing. But if it is some of these more intense, violent kind of shows, you'll be sort of in a hypnotic state while you're watching, but you'll afterwards it'll sort of catch up with you. Rely on gratitude. Be grateful for what you have. Be grateful for life. Be grateful for your family. Be grateful for your home. There's a remarkable body of literature in psychology that people who enumerate gratitude, keep gratitude journals. And we have 3 times a day when we say Modim. If you can think during Modim of what you have to be grateful for, that has, people who who actively express gratitude have lower levels of anxiety, have less depression, are more productive on work. They even higher levels of dopamine and serotonin in the central nervous system. Means that it's a natural tranquilizer as well. So we, especially now, we have to, when we're being so deprived, we have to be grateful. We have to be grateful for friends now that we have to be apart from them. And we have to be grateful for Hatzalah, that we have such a competent and skilled people who ensure our safety and protection. Be careful about unhealthy outlets. That's very important. We all have them. I'm not saying this in a judgmental way. But if you have a tendency to drink, be careful when you're stressed or when there's a lot of these kind of calls that you're not relying on alcohol to relax. If you want, you want to drink a l'chaim after the fish. I remember my father, when I was a kid, used to tell me that the fish has to swim. So I pictured this poor fish in an ocean full of bourbon. But but you know, that's fine. But if that's your Yetzer Hara, be careful, because under the great stressful situation, that's where you'll turn. If it's overeating, if it's temper outbursts, whatever it might be careful about the unhealthy outlets, because now you're all the more, all the more prone to it. Be careful you don't become too callous. It's important to feel the effect of what you're doing, to recognize that. And that's true for me as well. When I have to go and do a death notification, before I go, I'm a mess. When I leave, I'm a mess. While I'm there, like I'm sure you guys are, I'm very focused and scientific. I'm robotic. But don't lose sight of the enormity of what you do. And as I mentioned, know your limits. Know that there's, you can't be everything for everybody. And judge yourself by what you accomplish. I'll just conclude with a quick thought, and then if everybody has any questions or they want to throw something into the chat, more than welcome. There's a medrash that says, when it talks about with Avraham Avinu, when Eliezer is going by Avraham's request to find a wife for Yitzhak, and Eliezer says, "V'aseh chesedim Adoni Avraham," please do charity for my master Avraham. And the medrash is called tzvichim l'chesed. Everybody needs chesed. Even Avraham, who introduced the world to chesed, needs chesed. And so sometimes those of us who are the givers, who are the benefactors, who are the ones who are doing chesed for others, sometimes we need also to be recipients. And we shouldn't be embarrassed. We shouldn't be humiliated. The work is very stressful. And if you need to talk it out, if you need a break, if you need to process what you're going through, it's not a sign of weakness. It's just a sign of being human. That's pretty much what I have to say. And I guess I did 35 minutes. So if there's any questions, input, something that you wished I would have covered that I didn't, please feel free to unmute yourself and jump in, or use the chat to address it. Usually the first one is the one who has the hardest time doing that. So we'll see if anybody will. Anyone?
Dr. Blumenthal, you hear me?
Yes, I hear you. Please.
Hi, it's Yossi Friedman. Firstly, on behalf of the whole Hatzalah Crown Heights, I really want to thank you for that. And thank you, Rafi Smetana, for setting it up as well. I think that was very helpful, just to clarify, our thought processes, and just open up a little bit, take a little time to examine our emotions. Really, really appreciate it very much. I'll open the floor if anybody has a specific question. My only question is it abnormal to say we went through such a horrific traumatic event, and we feel, and I feel like I'm coping okay? Does that mean there's something wrong with me? And has my heart ceased to function, and I need a psychological CPR?
Okay. Well, first of all, what you just said is not good for business. So I hope there's not too much of that kind of strength around, because I'm going to have to make my prognosis some other way. No, we all have like anything else. Like some of us have a better immune system, and some of us can handle, some of us can get through the day on 5 hours sleep, and some of us need 7 hours sleep. We're all different. So you shouldn't be at fault if you think, you're handling it fine, it's not catching up with you. The only thing you have to be careful about is, as I said, that secondary trauma sneaks up on you. It's interesting that the research shows in secondary trauma that the group most vulnerable, if I were to divide up let's say, Hatzalah, police, firefighters, and I was to divide them up to three, one group would be, let's say, the rookies, the new people. One is sort of the middle people, and then one is the more senior people who has the most secondary trauma. And what the research seems to show is the middle people, because the newer people haven't had enough exposure yet, so that the trauma hasn't caught up with them. The more senior people have already developed ways to cope. They develop, without even planning to, ways to manage what they're dealing with. It's the ones in the middle who are most vulnerable, but that doesn't mean everybody's like anything else. Doesn't mean everybody's going to be is necessary risk. The interesting thing also, by the way, what they found in New York City in the study once was they found that police officers have higher levels of secondary trauma than firefighters. And the reason they believe is that in a police precinct, each cop car goes to a different traumatic event. In the firehouse, they all go as a unit together to a situation. My guess is that the Hatzalah garage is somewhere like the firefighters. In other words, when something happens, you're all kind of involved yourselves, unless it's like, especially if it's a big thing. So, but it shows how important it is, the sharing and doing things together. Okay, I see 3 chats, so let's just see what they are. Okay. Is it more concerning? It's a simple question. Is it more concerning not to feel anything, to feel unaffected? No, it could be you just don't, you have a very strong constitution and maybe it doesn't get to you. But if you find yourself fighting the feeling, and even if you win, but if you have to really fight it, then it's probably getting to you and you have to maybe, let it happen and deal with it. Okay, when do I reach for professional help? I have on and off insomnia, lost someone very close to me. I find speaking to friends helps me. Is that good enough? Okay, it's a very good question. The most people who have traumatic events can manage it without professional help. PTSD gets a lot of attention, post-traumatic stress disorder, but the D in PTSD stands for disorder, which means that you're not functioning. You're not going to work. You're not socializing. Well, not always socializing, but you're not interacting in a calm way with your family. If it's impinging on your life, it becomes disorder. Most people do not get PTSD. Some do. Most people cope with it. There is a post-traumatic reaction, which means that it's affecting you, but not so much so that it's compromising your functioning. If it's really in a significant way, if you're worried about yourself, it's compromising your functioning, by all means seek out professional help. And by the way, Ohel is available to you at any time. The Ohel trauma team, you can contact me, you can call into Ohel, and there's no charge. We're providing these services for free, as you guys do. So if you want to sort of test the waters and want to speak to me or one of the members of my team, please feel free to contact us at Ohel, or to contact me, or to contact Rachel Smetana. She'll help you with that. So you can always sort of check it out. And by the way, a lot of the people that I deal with in Hatzalah, it's a one-time meeting, and maybe even prescribing a break. But even just sometimes a one-time meeting, processing some of the very difficult calls you've had recently, then people are okay. So, there's something in between doing nothing and getting professional help. It could mean just, asking to have a one-time meeting with a trauma specialist and process it. But also, if you're talking to friends and it's becoming an active topic of conversation and you feel that as you discuss it more and as you're processing it more, it's becoming more and more tolerable. We have an expression in the field, 2 steps forward, 1 step backwards. Sometimes you go ahead, you move back a little bit, go ahead a little bit. But if it in general feels like you're reaching a crescendo, you don't have to necessarily rush and get professional help. But if you're not sure, give us a call and we'll process it with you. And it might be just one visit, or we might tell you, listen, this is really getting to you. I think you need to speak to somebody professionally. Okay, can you speak about some generic coping mechanisms? What does it mean to process it? So again, I'm going to say the same thing I said before. Processing it means just talking it out. Just talking about what happened. Just narrative. Tell it over. Tell it over as if you were writing a chapter in your book. The mere talking about it, the mere ensconcing it in words makes it more tolerable. If you need more, then we'll talk about some of the things you can do. You might have to take some time off. You might need to, do some sort of exercise, some sort of, soothing behavior. It might be, if that's, it might be learning. It might be pulling out a Gemara and doing the daf and losing yourself in that. It might be saying Tehillim. There are many different, and everybody's different. You can't say there's one size fits all. And people have different. What works for Ruvain may be toxic for Shimon. I'll tell you personally, I cannot run on a treadmill or do exercise in a gym. I tried it. I just think to expend that much effort and go nowhere is just too frustrating. I just don't like it. But I love hiking, and I can't go now, but in the past, I would once a month. There was a bunch of guys. I have this fake organization. I call it AIC. It stands for Arthritic Country Hiking Expedition. A bunch of old guys like me who spend the day in the woods hiking, usually Harriman State Park. And that, I'm like a new person afterwards. So we have, other people, my wife, she thinks I need a psychiatrist. She would never want to spend a day in the woods. Everybody has their own types of activities that are soothing, but processing means just speaking it out, just saying it over, just telling it over, and afterwards it's just less dangerous, it's less huge. Okay, any other questions, thoughts? Okay, and I just want to reiterate, I just want to again thank you guys for everything you do. We got another one coming through. Okay, thank you very much. Okay. Thank you guys again for everything that you do. And just know that Ohel's there for you. And so as are other organizations. I know we're not trying to monopolize the mental health field. We're actually setting up we had a TheraZoom and a virtual office, which was just an overload. So we're setting up a phone number for emergency calls. But you can just go to Ohel website. You can reach, call in or request some assistance, and I or another member of the trauma team will make ourselves available. If you wish to be in touch with me, contact Rafi, and she'll see that you can get in touch with me, and I'll try. I'm not right away offering my phone number because I'm being deluged, but if you feel that you really need to speak to me, then please put in a request through Ohel or through Rafi, and I'll try to get to it as soon as I can. Okay, and be well, and let's hope and pray that this will be over soon and we'll be back to our communal life in good health. Okay, be well. Okay, thank you, everybody.